The room went so quiet after the county hearing that I could hear somebody shifting in an old wooden chair across the room. And for a second, I honestly thought, this is what the end of a lie sounds like. Not loud, not dramatic, just suddenly too heavy for anyone to carry anymore. Funny thing is, though, that wasn't where this story began. That was just the moment everything finally caught up with one woman who believed confidence could replace ownership. Months earlier, I had bought a forgotten piece of land outside the edge of Maple Ridge County, the kind of place most people drove past without slowing down. The listing photos were terrible. The shoreline looked abandoned, the walking trail had almost disappeared under weeds, and the little lake sitting in the middle looked tired, like nobody had cared about it in years. My realtor actually asked me twice if I was sure I wanted to spend my savings on something that looked like nature itself had already given up on. I remember smiling and saying, that's exactly why I want it. Maybe that answer came from somewhere deeper than I realized. I'd spent years building businesses that always seemed to depend on somebody else's approval. Landlords raising rent, partnerships changing overnight, contracts disappearing because someone with more influence wanted a bigger piece. I got tired of building my life on borrowed ground. I wanted something simple, something that belonged to me because I had earned it, not because someone else allowed it. Before I touched a single shovel, I hired a survey company, paid for fresh boundary markers, requested every historical document the county had on the parcel, and even tracked down old aerial photographs from decades earlier. Some friends joked that I was treating a small lake like a military operation, but experience has a funny way of teaching you expensive lessons. I learned a long time ago that paperwork is a lot cheaper than lawsuits. Then the work began. Every weekend blurred together. I hauled broken timber out of the water, rebuilt drainage that hadn't worked in years, reinforced sections of shoreline that were slowly collapsing into the lake, planted native grasses to stabilize the banks, and rebuilt an old footpath one board at a time. Most evenings I'd sit on the dock after everyone left, covered in mud, drinking cheap coffee from a dented thermos, just watching the water settle back down. It wasn't perfect, but every day it looked a little more alive. And honestly, so did I. Then one afternoon, just as the restoration was finally starting to look like something I could be proud of, a black luxury SUV rolled slowly up my gravel driveway. The woman who stepped out looked like she had never owned a pair of work boots in her life. Perfect blazer, expensive sunglasses, hair that somehow stayed flawless despite the wind coming off the lake. She didn't introduce herself right away. She stood there studying the water like an investor inspecting property before making an offer. Finally, she smiled. "You've done impressive work," she said. It sounded like a compliment, but somehow it felt like an evaluation. "This lake has always been important to our community." I leaned against my fence and answered, "Well, according to my deed, it's important to me now." She laughed politely, though nothing about her eyes changed. "I'm Evelyn Harper," she said, "president of the Willow Creek Estates Association. We like to make sure natural amenities remain accessible for everyone." Accessible. Such an innocent word. Funny how dangerous certain words become when they're spoken by people who think they already own the ending of the conversation. I smiled back and said, "That's interesting. I thought private property was still a thing around here." Her smile tightened just enough for me to notice. Things have a way of evolving once the proper conversations begin. Then she climbed back in her SUV and drove away. I stood there longer than I probably should have, watching the dust settle behind her tires. Something about that conversation stayed with me all evening. It wasn't what she'd said, it was how carefully she'd chosen every word. That night, I created a folder on my computer labeled Lake Property, saved every email we'd exchanged, backed everything up twice, and started keeping a written log of every interaction. I couldn't explain why at the time. I just had this feeling, the kind you get before a thunderstorm, when the sky still looks clear but the air already feels different. By the time I started noticing the real shift, it didn't look like conflict yet. It looked like paperwork, polite emails, and harmless suggestions dressed up as community concern. That's the part most people miss, the slow part where nothing feels urgent enough to react to, but everything is already moving underneath you. Evelyn Harper didn't come back in person at first. Instead, I started receiving letters from the Willow Creek Estates Association. They were always written in that careful tone, the kind that tries to sound cooperative while quietly tightening the space around you. Concerns about visibility, recommendations for shared shoreline access, review of fencing alignment for community cohesion. Not demands, just pressure shaped like courtesy. At first, I treated them like noise. I had enough on my plate, just finishing the restoration work, and honestly, I didn't want to turn my new place into a battlefield over words on paper. But then something happened that changed the temperature of everything. I got one of those letters with photos attached. Pictures of my own dock, my own fence line, even a section of the walking path I had rebuilt plank by plank. But what caught my attention wasn't the images, it was the angles. They weren't taken from the road. They weren't taken from outside the property line. Someone had been inside the land, walking it, documenting it, like it was already shared space. I remember sitting at my kitchen table for a long time, just staring at those photos, not angry yet, more like trying to understand the shape of what I was looking at. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was documentation of presence. That's when I called Ruth, my neighbor a few lots over. Ruth was the kind of person who didn't get involved in anything unless she absolutely had to. And even then she'd tell you about it like she was annoyed the universe had interrupted her day. When I asked her if she had seen anyone around my property, she didn't hesitate. "White SUV," she said, "parked near your east boundary. 2 men, walking the shoreline like they own the place. Thought you knew." I didn't know. I wrote everything down after that. Time, description, direction, everything. Something inside me shifted at that moment. It wasn't fear exactly. It was clarity, because now I understood the direction this was heading. They weren't asking anymore. They were building familiarity step by step, like repetition could eventually turn into entitlement. A week later, I received a notice from the county. Something about stormwater compliance review and potential obstruction to emergency access routes. The language was dense, technical, carefully designed so that most people would assume resistance meant guilt. But I'd already pulled my own records before I even bought the land, so I went straight to the county office and requested the original submission tied to my parcel. That's when I saw it. A sketch map, not part of any official plat, not from any historical file. Just a newly added drawing showing a maintenance corridor cutting directly across my property toward the lake. It looked official at a glance, and that was the danger of it. Because official-looking things have a way of becoming accepted truths if nobody challenges them early. But the timestamp told a different story. It was created just days after Evelyn's first visit. That was the moment I stopped thinking this was about community standards. This was construction, but not of land. Of narrative. 3 mornings later, I woke up to the sound of engines. Heavy ones. The kind that don't belong on quiet private land. I stepped outside with my coffee still in my hand and saw 2 contractor trucks already unloading materials near the shoreline. Posts, metal panels, tools laid out like they were preparing a job site that had already been approved. And standing slightly off to the side, arms folded, sunglasses on, was Evelyn. She wasn't working. She never touched anything. She just directed, pointed, adjusted, like she was overseeing something that had already been decided somewhere else. I walked down slowly and said, "You're on private property." One of the contractors looked at her first, not me. That told me everything I needed to know. Evelyn smiled like she had been expecting this moment. "This is temporary access installation pending county clarification." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how carefully she had package control inside language that sounded harmless. "Pack it up," I said. She stepped closer, just enough to make it personal. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." And there it was. Not a request, a framing. As if resistance itself was the problem, not the act of entering my land without permission. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Not dramatically, just steadily. Because at that point I wasn't guessing anymore about what this was. I called the sheriff, then my attorney, and I stayed right there while the contractors kept working like hesitation would eventually be rewarded with permission. When the deputy finally arrived, the energy shifted immediately. Nobody needed to say anything for him to understand something wasn't right. I walked him through the boundary markers, showed him the survey data, showed him the plat map versus the sketch that didn't belong. And slowly, the story they had built started to break apart in real time. The contractors admitted they had no official work order, just instructions. Evelyn tried to maintain control of the narrative, but every sentence she used started to sound weaker the longer the evidence stayed visible. And then the deputy's body cams started capturing everything. That was the first crack. And once it opened, I could see it wasn't going to close again the same way. After the deputy left that day, the air around the lake changed in a way I can't really explain unless you've lived through something where the surface story stops matching what's actually happening underneath. On paper, it was still just a dispute about access and permits. But in reality, it had already turned into something else entirely, a quiet war of documentation, timing, and who could prove what first. My attorney told me something simple that stuck with me. Don't argue their version. Out-document it. So that's what I did. Every email, every notice, every photo, every timestamp, every interaction, it all went into a single growing file that started to feel less like paperwork and more like a second memory of everything happening around me. Then we pulled records. That's when the structure behind it started to show. There were internal HOA communications referencing my property as a future shared amenity corridor. There were drafts of maintenance proposals that had never been disclosed to me. There were emails between a landscaping contractor and a county assistant describing access planning as if it was already agreed in principle. Nothing final, nothing official on its face, but everything pointing in one direction. And the most unsettling part wasn't even the content. It was the confidence behind it. Like they weren't trying to take something directly. They were trying to slowly make resistance feel unreasonable. That's when I understood Evelyn's real strategy. It wasn't confrontation. It was normalization. If you repeat a claim long enough, if you document it often enough, if you show up physically enough times, people stop asking whether it's true and start asking whether it's already accepted. But there was one thing she miscalculated. I wasn't alone anymore in what I was seeing. A neighbor from 2 streets oversent me a recording from a community meeting. I almost didn't believe it when I first heard it. Evelyn's voice, calm as ever, explaining to residents that the lake would soon function as a connected walking feature for all Willow Creek homeowners. Someone in the room asked a simple question, whether the legal access had actually been established. And she said it. Control matters more than title in early transitions. There was a silence after that in the recording that felt heavier than the words themselves. Because that wasn't a misunderstanding. That was intent spoken out loud. From that point forward, things accelerated. We subpoenaed contractor billing records. That's where the language got even more revealing. One line buried in a change order stood out immediately. Install removable pedestrian access point per E. Harper instruction, maintain appearance of temporary public benefit pending county review. Appearance, not safety, not necessity, not compliance. Optics. I remember actually leaning back in my chair when I read that. Not because I was surprised anymore, but because everything suddenly made sense in a way that was almost frustratingly clean. The entire strategy depended on perception staying ahead of verification. But verification had already caught up. The county hearing was scheduled within weeks, faster than I expected. And on the morning of it, I stood outside my truck for a moment longer than usual, just listening to the quiet of the lake. It didn't feel like victory yet. It felt like pressure about to release. The hearing room was exactly what you'd expect: fluorescent lights, cheap wood paneling, people pretending they were only there for process. Evelyn arrived early, of course she did. Same posture, same confidence, same controlled expression, like nothing had ever slipped out of place. She spoke first. She framed everything beautifully. Community stewardship, share natural resources, long-term value for residents. If you didn't know the background, you might have believed her completely. That's the part one respect, even now. She wasn't careless. She was deliberate. But then my attorney stood up. No emotion, no performance, just sequence. Survey map, original plat, then the unauthorized sketch, then the photos showing entry points inside the property line, then Ruth's testimony, then the contractor statements, then the body cam footage, then the billing records, then the internal HOA communications, then the recorded audio. Each piece didn't need explanation because each one contradicted the version before it, and the room started to shift. Not dramatically, just subtle things. People leaning forward. Someone exhaling like they had been holding their breath too long. The deputy looking down at the table longer than before. Evelyn still sitting perfectly still, but something in her expression starting to tighten in a way she couldn't fully control anymore. Then the final document went up. The change order. That single line about optics. The room didn't react out loud, but something settled in it, like a shared realization that the story they had been hearing wasn't just incomplete, it had been constructed. The county officer finally spoke. Any asserted access claim is suspended pending legal review. Simple, clean, final. Evelyn tried to respond, just once, but my attorney was already moving forward with the injunction request. Removal of all unauthorized installations. Correction of records. Formal acknowledgement of boundary validity. There wasn't really anything left to debate after that, because at that point, it stopped being about interpretation. It was just documentation. Weeks later, everything was reversed. The sketch disappeared from county records. The installations were removed. The HOA issued formal corrections to residents. Contractors came back quietly to dismantle what they had put up in the first place, almost like they were undoing something they never fully understood while building it. Evelyn didn't stay on the board much longer after that. No dramatic exit. No final confrontation. Just a quiet removal from authority, like the structure around her finally stopped supporting the story she had been telling. And the lake, it went back to what it was supposed to be. Cleaner. Quieter. Mine. One evening after it was all over, I stood there with a couple of friends, watching the light fade across the water. Someone asked me if I'd ever deal with something like that again. I remember thinking about it for a second. Then I said, if I do, I won't wait as long next time. And I meant it. Because the biggest thing I learned through all of this wasn't about property or law or even conflict. It was about how easily people can turn repetition into reality and how fragile that reality becomes the moment someone finally brings out the receipts. Now I'm curious where you stand on it. Was this about protecting community access, like she said, or was it a slow attempt to turn assumption into ownership? And more importantly, if you were in my position, would you have fought it all the way through like I did, or step back just to keep the peace? Let me know in the comments.